Perfect. Okay. So, welcome everyone. My name is Stephen Perry, and I am the current chair of the LGBTQ Advocacy Committee from the ASA, the American Statistical Association. So, I really appreciate everyone being here. This is our third annual webinar, and our webinars are interdisciplinary, and so we try to bring in professionals from different areas of life, of expertise that can inform us from different angles on topics around LGBTQ and statistics related concepts. So today, what we have are two panelists. We have Kevin Guyan, and he is a Chancellor's Fellow at the University of Edinburgh and the director of the Gender and Sexuality Data Lab. We also have Delane Compton, who is a full professor of sociology at the University of New Orleans. This webinar, which I've titled Current and Historical Trends in SOGISC Data and Its Consequences, has been a bit of a journey, let's say, in getting it started. And what I mean by that is when I initially conceived of this panel, it consisted of completely different panelists, and each one of them individually came to their own conclusion that it wasn't safe for them to present. So I want to just say, thank you for the panelists for taking the time and to acknowledge, the strength it takes to talk about these topics to the public. I really appreciate that. And with that in head, I just want to, before we begin, there's a few things. I used an acronym already that people may not be familiar with. So when I mentioned SOGISC, that is standing for Sexual Orientation, Gender Identity, and Sex Characteristics. So sometimes you may see this acronym either during these presentations or elsewhere. So just to be clear that we're on that same page. Um, After how this panel will and this webinar will be organized is that the two panelists will present for roughly about 15 minutes or so, 15 to 20 minutes depending. And then we will have a Q&A session afterwards. So if you happen to have questions, it would be very helpful to receive those questions so that we can have a little bit of a discussion afterwards. I believe that we are going to be starting out with Delane's workshop, or not workshop, presentation. And just to give, again, a little bit more context to Delane's background. So again, she is a full professor of sociology at the University of New Orleans. The research employs social psychology and demography to examine sexual, gender, and family inequalities and improve research design. Compton is a co-author of Same-Sex Partner, The Social Demography of Sexual Orientation, and Legalizing LGBTQ Families, How the Law Shapes Parenthood. So I really appreciate Delane being here, and feel free, you should be able to unmute yourself. I'm sorry if I used the wrong pronoun, I'm not sure, but I really appreciate you being here. Thank you.
Yes. Yeah, technically I usually use they or he, but I'm of the era where it's not as important to me. Okay, so first let me just start off by saying thank you so much for this opportunity, and thank you to Stephen for organizing and setting everything up, and Donna for rescuing me related to the slides. Yeah, so I actually spent a great deal of time thinking about what to title this talk and actually what I wanted to talk about. And this talk is marketed around data collection and its consequences. So I kept the title simple and straightforward. The data collection portion also brings to mind notions of survey and measurement construction and the lack of, while the consequences, there's everything from politics to material resources to feelings, and that felt pretty big. So as such, I decided to orient around my main areas of academia, sociology, and demography, and the very earnest goal, maybe my very earnest goal of trying to understand a population, how it changes, um, and why so that we can make informed decisions about policy and resources. Academically, this is the ideal. However, I'm aware that this pursuit may be more aspirational than attainable, especially in current times, and all the give and take, back and forths, or sometimes 2 to 3 steps backwards that we make. I do still think it's important to have the pursuit. Here's a little overview what I want to cover today. I decided to start with a little bit of a history and background, which I don't think we spend enough time recognizing how far we've come and how new this work is, um, particularly related to even defining the population. Stemming from this, I'm going to show a sociological example that foreshadows the rest of the talk, specifically issues with uh, data collection problems and data problems themselves. I'll then give some insights on moving forward statistically and a lot of questions maybe there at the end before I bump it off to Kevin. Now, just to give a little history and background, I do think in the most idealistic sense, the ultimate goal for demographers is in collecting SOGI data or SOGISC data is to better understand the experiences, needs, and disparities faced by what we claim to be the LGBTQ plus population or populations within. And I think our big goal is really to inform inclusive policies and services and to ensure equitable access to things like health and education and other societal resources. But we're just at the beginning and it's pretty messy and it's a pretty complex problem. Modern data collection, in my opinion, my perspective, which I feel pretty confident about, really starts to emerge in the 1990s, related to like what we conceptually refer to as SOGI data now. Prior to that, there's a great deal of groundwork that was laid and prior work that was done. For example, while not demographic per se, Kinsey and Evelyn Hooker were pivotal characters in developing conceptual theories of homosexuality, particularly by challenging the view of it as pathological. This work also played a crucial role in shaping normative and non-pejorative language to describe homosexuality and individuals who identify as homosexual. This work laid groundwork to give us there were a lot of disbeliefs as to who would answer questions, let's say it that way, who would speak to researchers, who would speak to academics. So we actually learned a lot from this era of work. And then as we move into the next piece that I see as being very influential related to the demography anyway, is that we see a lot of work that starts happening on American households and couples. I am kind of staying within the US here. And with regards to American couples and relationship dynamics, we start to see same-sex couples to be included, in part to discuss power differentials, but they were being included nevertheless. And and then also during the 80s, we have the urban geographers really start doing some pioneering research related to like the spatial concentration of gay communities, and linking them to urban transformation and the expanding scope of sexuality studies. Most importantly, mostly importantly to sexualities research, they really unveil the sites of study. So in the 1980s and the early 90s, we see a move also towards identities, likely driven by community building and ongoing social movements. Most of this work was qualitative, but this is the work that really starts to lead to the measurement work. And we see clinicians also drawing on this work to start ascertaining information related to health. And so around this time in the 80s and the 90s, we really start thinking about how we're gonna maybe like conceptualize a population, how we're conceptualizing lesbian, gay men as a group. So out of this work, we then start creating kind of measurement work and also reworking that work and continuing on with qualitative work also. But we start to begin to learn something about the gay and lesbian population. And at this time, I'm specifically going to say gay and lesbian because it was overwhelmingly speaking to gay men or the idea of people who identified as gay men and lesbian women. Um, and its context within the greater population. I do think there is questions about who this population is and where they are, but also a lot of questions about them in context to the mainstream American population. Uh, I do think many of the goals were also initially about providing services to the gay and lesbian population. Now, in the mid 1990s, we start to see some reviewing of work and cataloging that begins, cataloging of where data sources are, where people live, things like that. For example, Selen Petrullio's 1996 paper is a seminal piece that addresses critical issues in defining, identifying, and sampling LGBT populations. It's basically a review of like a med search engine, and they start looking at uh, how prior qualitative work and prior work addressing LGBT issues. Um, Really, it's largely LG issues, and how people are creating their samples and who they're drawing on and who's responding. In all honesty, also. Now, this starts to highlight the challenges of operationalizing these groups and starts emphasizing the need for standardization of definitions and methodologies for demographic work. And in order to improve the accuracy and consistency of studies and what we know of a population as a whole. Um, so this makes pretty significant contribution to the field, and it does seem to be a big foothold that we are able to establish. Randall Sell also established the gaydata.com, which I think later became lgbtdata.com. And I have not been able to find it online for the past year or two. I don't know if I tried the year before last. So I don't remember when I last tried prior to that. But documenting the availability of LGBT data across a wide array of sources. This initiative played a crucial role in, in promoting the visibility and accessibility of LGBT data, and served as an impactful resource for scholars and researchers during the time of, say, my grad school. And I think after that too. At this point, we also start to have nationally representative data sets and start including SOGI questions and measures, or proxy measures for same-sex households. But we start to gain a little bit of enumeration and some information on attitudes toward um, uh, what we would more broadly identify as LGBT issues now, or LGBT people, in all honesty, if we're talking about the GSS. Um, the availability of the census same-sex couple data in the 1990s and the early 2000s also starts to spur some key analyses for social policy in the U.S. Included in these studies on gay and lesbian household studies, impact of sexual orientation, discrimination on income, effects of anti-discrimination policies on earnings and the economics of marriage, spatial distribution of unmarried partners. Those are some of the very first studies that we have, first analyses we have, demographically speaking. These analyses provide pretty valuable insights into the economic and social patterns of same-sex couples. They help support and challenge stereotypes, and they help to further shape out the field, including further analyses of measurement, income, what households look like, households with children exist. So I was bucking a big stereotype. And they're really the first studies and applications of topics of residential segregation and measures for residential segregation, immigration, and economic work. It's around this time in the early 2000s that we start to see the field being kind of established here, but it's very much also grappling with how sexual orientation is defined or can be defined and how it's measured, and it's very much grappling with concerns for and measurement error. And the idea of moving forward for future data collection and trying to build more data collection. From this point, I want to kind of pivot for a moment, and I want to take a moment and show you something that I think is significant from the field of sociology that I would imagine is highly applicable and relatable to others, other area of focus. And this is meant to be somewhat collaborative in nature to really show how quantitative and qualitative work go together and work together, because it is really the qualitative folks that give us the insights on, how people are identifying, how people are responding, how people are uh, or how we can measure. So I think this is actually a really important point, but I also want to show you how new we are, and erratic maybe the field has been, and how much it might actually be booming. So this is a study that I've been continuing to do. We're about to add another year to this, where we look at JSTOR articles from all of the sociology journals, and we basically use the keyword search of abstracts and titles for JSTOR identified sociology journals and population studies journals. And we use the keywords for anything we could think of that would be related to the LGBT queer population. So lesbian, gay, homosexual, bisexual, transgender, transsexual, same-sex partners, queer, non-binary, gender non-conforming, gender queer, agender, NB, asexual, two-spirit, intersex. We used all of the initials LGBTQ, LGBT, LGBTQIA, LGBTQ plus, and so forth. We did limit our sample to only research articles, and we limited only to articles published in the sociological journals or population journals. Uh, and we limited our articles to anything related to individuals, communities, or publications. And at the very end, what we found was about, a little bit less than 300 articles since JSTOR, since the start of the JSTOR, which is begins with 1956. And uh, overall, what I really want to show you guys here is that, we have very little quantitative work that we're doing and have been doing. So only about 30% today accounts for the quantitative work. And in this, I did look to from nationally representative surveys. So from our federal data and national data. We also, I think it also includes state level data. But some other details that are kind of interesting is that only about 13% of these articles through to 2022 are comparative with a heterosexual population or sample. Uh, 10% of them are directly concerned with HIV, and 20% of them are funded by government. So just kind of wanted to point some of that out just for some context, because this is the thing I think is really interesting and actually very beautiful. But here we can see a surge in qualitative work. We can see a surge that kind of starts. The qualitative work is the gray work. We do tend to have more qualitative work in this sample, and we really see a surge that starts to happen after Butler and gender trouble. This is where we see a lot of the identity construction start happening, which I think is important moving forward and understanding our culture and context, particularly related to non-binary and trans identities and queer identities. I think that's going to be important for us to really recognize. And then we can also see small surges when the census drops in 2010 and 2020. I think the census, as of 2010, the census data became, quote, more believable and was considered to be a little better and or useful for our goals. And we can kind of see how this also spurs qualitative work. So I think it's really worth noting, quant and qual work together, and there are clear qual booms post national data releases. This is another piece of my advocacy for the fact that we need more national data and that all sexualities researchers should care about that. Also worth noting, we did not have more than 20 articles published across all of the sociology journals in a given 3-year span. Now, I suspect this will have significantly changed in 2025, for the mere fact that I know I personally had 5 publications in 2024. So I imagine we're going to see some booms going off. I know we've had a new journal that's opened, specifically related to sex and sexuality. So I think we're going to see an increase here. But I did want to show you how small and rare publication was through 2022 in the sociological discipline. I also think it's kind of interesting to point out populations of interest over time from this work. So this is all the quantitative and qualitative work. And as you can see, majority of the research has always been focused on, you can see that it's been focused more on the, in current times, there's still more of a focus on gay, followed by lesbian, followed by bisexual, and then we start to see transgender come up here a little bit. Um, for what that is worth. So in speaking to who we know about and what we know about and who we measure, we are actually better at collecting data on and measuring the gay population. And then we're next a little bit better on the lesbian population. And so it's interesting thinking about how this might change, particularly since we're seeing the bisexual population really start to grow. But we've only very, very recently started giving attention to bisexuality, or the bisexual population and the trans population. And we have very few surveys at all that even address the non-binary population. So that's a whole new game for us. Now, overall, we have a big theoretical issue when it comes to data problems. We have imposed categories in the past and in a cultural context that has been set in time. Sometimes we've done this without really thinking about them or what they mean. Sometimes we're drawing on proxies for these measurements because they're the best that we have. But this is actually pretty significant, and I think creates a lot of points of criticism for academics and for thinkers and activists for that matter. We also have a lacking data problem altogether. SOGI measurement is just highly unavailable. There's so few surveys that it is available to us on, so that SOGI measurements and questions are even available for us to pick up on. Most of the time we didn't consider the category or ask the question. So this is kind of the biggest data problem that we have going on. And so if you'll click 2 more slides. Yeah. And, when it comes down to, getting to the fine tuning some of these theoretical issues, probably one of the larger issues we have is identity capture. So how to measure, defining, how we define, how we categorize. And this is important because it affects how we understand. How we categorize affects how we count, who we count, and onto the various outcomes that shape our understandings and inequalities. More specifically, there are theoretical issues related to identity capture and how to measure, specifically for gender measurement and for sexual orientation measurement. In the past, we've had identity conflation. We've considered the population as a whole, or we identify the population as a queer population. I guess it just means not the cis straight population. And so, we take these little shortcuts. And so it is important for us to think about gender identity. It's important for us to think about the ways in which sex and gender can conflate, even within, say, the 2-step measure, how we might draw on one question versus drawing on both questions in speaking to a conclusion or in doing an analysis. So precise terminology is important and it does matter. Also the fact that we often talk about LGBTQ plus, but might really only mean the LG or the LGB. So who are we really speaking to is important. We also, I think, have some differences in what we consider to be sexuality and sexual orientation or sexual orientation. I'm sure many people may be aware of the differences in identity measures, behavior measures, or desire measures. We probably also likely need a perception measure that we haven't figured out how to do that just yet. But it's also interesting to think about how someone identifies their sexuality or their sexual community versus how maybe they would identify their orientation, and how researchers may be conflating these 2 terms also. And then lastly, we can have discussions about population sizes, but also the extreme disproportionate sizes of the groups within the LGBT population, and then within the LGBT and of the LGBT population together comparatively to the heterosexual population. So having a small group with a large majority, it can create a lot of noise within our analyses, and that also needs to be grappled with. Now, we have a few more problems to talk about related to just how large and dynamic the population is. It's a stigmatized and disproportionately vulnerable population. Gender and sexual minorities are a super dynamic identity group. We're also in a moment with what feels like to be a lot of significant and changing and shifting identities and or identity terminology. So we have varying rates depending on how we measure. We have new identities that are being developed and introduced. We have some identities that are being falling away. But all of this is extremely problematic for population research. Most of all, individuals are changing well, no, actually, I want to talk about that. Anyway, it's the point is it's very complicated and messy, especially speaking demographically. So on one hand, we have gender and sexual minorities that are this super potentially dynamic population, including sexual orientations, gender identities, desires, organizations, communities, intersex individuals. We have indigenous third gender populations. We have asexuality. We have polyfolk. We have agender. We have gender fluid, trans, and so on. And on the other hand, we maybe have some of the worst practices and attention from researchers historically in speaking to those populations, maybe even recognizing those populations. So overall, there's a pretty big understudied area of research, and our research practices to study this population are also underdeveloped. And this does hinder both quant and qual work. I think this also hinders resources and material goods in people's actual lives. Academically, it's hard to publish. We just know so little and have no data. Most of what we know is based on small scale studies, convenient samples, gay men in certain locales. How is it that we want to expand on this? Oftentimes when we try to expand on this, it's challenged and critiqued. People may not want to believe our findings. It may go against what somebody's expectations were, their own experiences. In many cases, reviewers may also draw on their gut reactions as to whether our findings seem believable. And they actually have more opinions than actual criticisms or construction, helpful construction with their reviews. It's also super easy to attack methods if you don't like a finding and to question the research design and the methodological underpinnings of an article if you know there's something about it that you just aren't okay with or don't like. So it seems to be a little bit of an uphill climb. However, it does seem like we also have some footholds. In moving on to my last slide related to more problems, we also have the large scale issue that there is just a lack of data. We also have a lack of protocols for data collection. Best practices are extremely set in context and culture. Oftentimes too, when people are making decisions, they may not be making them with a specific research question in mind. A specific research question should drive which measures you use, what measures you believe to be most helpful. So going back to Research 101, I feel like this is very often not done, in part because we don't have very many options. Back to the lack of data again. We're also challenging a traditional measurement. We're challenging cultural understandings. We're dealing with social tolerance. And we also may have a lot of ideas and feelings about how we should be doing things. Between advocates, scholars, and statisticians, we can have a great diversity in opinion on how we should collect data, what measures we should use, and so forth. So to sum up, we lack data, we lack protocols for dealing with the measurement and data, and we're challenging a traditional measurement specifically regarding sex and gender, which conceptually are some of our most employed and rigid categories historically, and seem to be the most, they feel quite threatening to change. So this is important and significant because all of this affects, our future knowledge building. Now, I'm actually going to skip the next slide and move right into the early 2000s. And through the early 2000s, we did demonstrate through census and national data that data can be collected and that it's useful. or it can be useful. So we showed that people can be counted. We showed that there's diversity in groups among those who identify as LGBT. We showed that they are located everywhere in the US. We showed that there are diverse enclaves. We showed that men and women don't necessarily live together in the same enclaves. And so we've definitely carved out some understanding that 20 years ago would have been unheard of. I remember at the very start of my career, people did not believe there were gay people in Texas, and people did not believe that they did believe all gay enclaves also are where the lesbians lived. So those are kind of two big things that changed in the course of my career with this data. We also showed that sexual orientation does affect outcomes. Health, income, education, households, who you live with, how you live. We started disentangling gender and sexuality measures. And we started seeing trends and disparities and inequalities between cis, straight, and LGBT populations. This part's pretty important, I think, because even though we may not do the best job of capturing everybody with measures, we have been able to demonstrate trends in inequality and trends in disparities in treatment and outcomes for overall group of, say, the LGBT population or the queer population. And I think that's been pretty important. So while we don't always recognize individual experience, we are able to show the experience of a structure being applied to you and disadvantaging a group. Now, this kind of leaves us to our current data collection. According to the NASEM report in 2022, we had 14 national data sources that were collecting some form of SOGI and SC measurement. It's kind of interesting because between 2022 and 2024 and 2025, we had a whole host of new data sets that were becoming available and that were having the two-step question put on, having trans questions added, and having measures of sexual orientation added. However, it's unclear where we are today. And I can just give you two examples of the household pulse data and the PRAMS data as an example. Both of these have sent out some waves, but we don't know where the data is. It's been taken down. Data won't be analyzed. Tara Becker was giving me a great example yesterday of the PRAMS data. All of that data has been removed online. Everybody from that office has also been fired. Therefore, even if the data that was collected that did have some SOGI measure most recently will not be analyzed. There's nobody to receive requests to let people analyze data and so forth. So that's very much in flux and very unclear right now and very much a mess. The last thing I wanted to talk about was kind of the consequences and concerns. I came up with this little table of the positives and negatives for collecting data. In short, data collection is not neutral, and it's fact a political act. It reflects values and it carries risk. Ethical data practices must balance knowledge production with respect for individual rights and community well-being. This is particularly for LGBTQ plus populations whose identities, whose experiences, and visibility has historically been shaped by systems of surveillance, erasure, and misrepresentation. While collecting data on sexual orientation and gender identity can support inclusion, policy development, and resource allocation, it does carry risk, such as breaches of privacy, exposure to harm, or the reinforcement of the binary, normative categories that fail to reflect the full diversity of queer and trans lives. Without intentional design, community awareness, and ethical safeguards, SOGI data collection may replicate the very marginalization it seeks to redress. We also know that without data collection, though, we can't assess impact and we can't document harm. The big takeaway here is that numbers matter and are meaningful, and they do impact lives. I tend to fall a little bit on the side of collect the data and give people the information related to privacy and confidentiality and let them choose for themselves whether they want to be counted. I also believe conservative numbers can be telling. So that's just my perspective where I stand. We can talk more about that later. But moving forward statistically, uh, uh, this is pretty much my last slide. We do need to spend more time sussing out and figuring out the best way to capture trans and non-binary populations. And protocols for dealing with them. I do suspect at times those populations may be very different. So we may have like a bimodal population when we're doing data analysis, and other times they may be very similar. This is something I'm kind of working on right now to assess, whether or not it's okay to always collapse them together into one another just because they're small. And I'm going to tell you, I don't think it's okay. So, anyway, but this is something we need to think about moving forward. I think we also need more data sources, and specifically more funding for data sources and its analysis. And that's a huge ask and a big ask. It's heartbreaking what's happened this past year, and feeling like we were actually maybe headed that way, you know. I've never in my life been funded for my LGBT work before. And for the first time I had NSF funding. I felt like I had options for that. We had options for creating new surveys. That's not currently happening. We also need to focus more on comparative analyses. We have very little work on comparative attitudes. We have very little work on how LGBT populations vote comparatively, what's important to them. We have just overall very few analysis on the comparative analyses. And then maybe also we care about that from the within group too. So within the LGBT community, comparisons if that's available. Okay, so I'm gonna go ahead and leave off there because I think that is my time, and I want to toss over to Kevin, and I think this is a good place to go ahead and stop. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Delane. That was a really informative presentation, and I think that you uh, really set it up very well for Kevin, who is going to be talking about queer data. And I will say this is how I found out about Kevin, is that his book that came out a few years ago on queer data, I bought that, I read it, and then when I was looking for participants for this panel, I reached out to him, and I really appreciate his work. So, Kevin, I'm going to give you control now and take it away.
Great, thank you. So hopefully people can see my screen and see me still. Great, if any tech things happen, please shout. But thank you so much, Stephen, for the invite to join today's webinar. And Delane, thank you for that fantastic kind of overview of what is a kind of wide and complex topic. In my kind of contribution today, I want to do two things. So firstly, I want to highlight some recent history of what's been happening in Scotland and the UK. So I'm joining you today from Edinburgh, but zoom out and think actually what can we learn from some of these kind of recent events around gender, sex and sexuality data? That's the kind of the term I'll be using in my talk today. And in the second part of my contribution, I want to think about this current political moment and offer 4 paths or 4 ways forward how we might try and navigate out of this kind of currently challenging political moment for SOGI data. So that's the plan of action. What I like to do when I'm doing these online talks, just to give a bit of a kind of sense of the human behind the screen, say a little bit more about who I am, a bit about my background. So although I do a lot of work now with quantitative data, my background is actually in history. So my PhD was in history back in 2016. I then thought academia, it's not for me. I have no desire to continue going down this path. So went and worked doing diversity, equality and inclusion work for around 5 years. Around 2018, 2019, I became fixated with the design of the census in Scotland, which I'm going to say a little bit more on later on, and ended up writing a book all about queer data on how we collect, analyse and use gender, sex and sexuality data back in 2022. Since then, I joined the University of Edinburgh, where I run our Gender and Sexuality Data Lab, and very excitingly, last week, published my second book, Rainbow Trap, which looks at queer categories, classifications, and labels. So I think kind of common to all this work, the kind of common feature in everything I've done so far is I'm really interested in that space where different data practices, so whether it's quantitative, qualitative, whether it's surveys, whether it's interviews, what happens when they rub up against and meet different identity categories? In particular, in my work, what happens when data meets questions of gender, sex, and sexuality? And how do the decisions we make about data, so what to count, how to count, who to count, how do they invite differential harms for queer communities? So where to start? We were kind of encouraged to think about the history, so I've tried to think historically, where might I start my talk? I mentioned my background's in history. I'm not going to take us too far back into the distant past, just 6 years back to 2019. So I wonder who remembers 2019. It was the year of Little Nas X, the Notre Dame fire, the film version of Cats, and for those living or working in the UK, Boris Johnson and Brexit. Less famously, it also featured Joan McAlpine, and this is a former member of the Scottish Parliament who at the time was convener of a very powerful committee in the Scottish Parliament with oversight of the nation's census. In this role, McAlpine held a huge amount of power over Scotland's census, which takes place every 10 years. And it was really interesting as well, because the upcoming census, which took place in 2022, was adding 2 new questions. So the census had a new question on sexual orientation and a new question on trans status or history. So these questions were really trailblazing, particularly the sexual orientation question. At the time, hardly any countries in the world asked a census question about sexual orientation, but this committee had a real kind of key role in designing the questions being asked. Now, McAlpine did champion the addition of new questions in the census, but only if they aligned with her particular views about gender, sex, and sexuality. I'm going to play a really short clip from you from 2019, where Joan McAlpine describes her approach to inclusion in the census. And please shout if the audio doesn't come through for any reason.
Gives a much wider list of options,
yes,
though.
after we passed the bill, we discovered, almost accidentally, that they planned to ask about all sorts of other things in the drop-down box in the electronic census, and that includes things like demisexual, demi-romantic, and things that are not sexual orientations at all.
I mean, these are things that most people probably haven't heard of. Demi-romantic, it says, only experiences romantic attraction after developing emotional connection beforehand. But a lot of them are things that certainly I'd never heard of before.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, sexual orientation is an important thing to ask about. Demi-romantic means that you expect to be taken to dinner and maybe bought a bunch of flowers before you start getting physical. That's not a sexual orientation. And it also includes asexuality, which means that you're not interested in sex even if you are bought dinner and flowers. That's not a sexual orientation either. And it actually trivialises the census and makes it more like a cosmopolitan quiz instead of a serious data gathering exercise.
So I'd like to share this clip of the prominent Scottish politician, Joan McAlpine, to highlight a longer lineage of anti-LGBTQ activities taking place in Scotland, anchored around questions of data, administrative practices, and who counts. Because in the clip, McAlpine, who is someone, as far as we know, who identifies as straight and cisgender, repeats a line. That's not a sexual orientation. So for me, this highlights that while some LGBTQ people are counted in something like a national census, the design of data collection tools ensures that particular characteristics or ways of thinking about identity are designed out of the process. Because when we scratch the surface, we see that this national data exercise, which was praised internationally for its new questions on sexual orientation and trans status, continue to ask a binary sex question about sex that required all respondents to identify their sex as either male or female. For non-binary people who may not identify in this way, non-completion was not an option. This was a compulsory question, where if you chose to refuse, you risked a fine of up to £1,000. So what did Scotland census tell us? Well, excitingly, last year we got those headline figures, those headline percentages, and we know that in Scotland, at least the data tells us, 4.0% of the population aged 16 and over identify as LGBT+, and 0.4% of the population aged 16 and over identify as trans or as having a trans history. Now, it's a few years since the census took place in Scotland, and things haven't turned out exactly as planned. In my work, I highlight how the collection of more data about LGBTQ lives invites potential opportunities, but also potential dangers. Across the UK, census data about the size of the LGBTQ population, in particular the number of trans people, has become politicized in ways that serve the interests of those opposed to LGBTQ equalities. I'm not exaggerating when I say basically at least every week or every few weeks there's some new headline in the press, in the media, about data, about how LGBTQ people are counted, and how this kind of counting of these communities has become a real source of political action for those opposed to LGBTQ equalities. Going back to what Elaine was saying earlier, numbers and categories are political. And in Scotland, in the UK, the seemingly mundane kind of concepts of how systems count and categorise and record LGBTQ people has become a key frontier in the fight for equalities. I'm not being over the top when I say that the design of categories and classifications is one of the key battlegrounds for LGBTQ equalities, particularly for trans and non-binary people in the UK. And I'm sure, as many of you are aware, efforts to erase trans people from existing in law, data and policy has become a key strategy in the UK's anti-trans movement. My point here is that there's a dark side to inclusion. You are counted, but on someone else's terms. And I call this problem a rainbow trap. Although data practices aren't often spoken about in this space, the dangers of queer inclusion has a long history that dates back until at least the early 2000s, and critiques of LGBT rights campaigns that prioritised entry into institutions such as the police, armed forces, global finance, and other kind of questionable institutions. So what can we do now? I want to, in the kind of second part of my contribution, think about the current moment and think kind of where do we go from here? I want to bring in some ideas from my new book, Rainbow Trap, and think how do we kind of respond to this kind of anti-trans authoritarian political moment. I want to caveat as well that I'm living and working in the UK, so kind of what I'm presenting here speaks particularly to this context, but I hope there's some wider implications and effects in terms of the context that you're all working in as well. So I've got 4 of them, and my first kind of way forward or path forward is about holding ground and not changing how we work on or speak about gender, sex, and sexuality data. I've shared some examples of language and approaches where in the past few months in my work in the UK, I've noticed some worrying acceptance that these claims are an accepted norm or best practice, when actually they reflect a departure from the status quo. I'm not going to go through these in detail, but these are kind of ways of speaking about data, ways of communicating about data that are becoming increasingly normalized, but actually within this normalization, They actually mask a lot of politics, a lot of questions of power, of history. So my kind of hope is here trying to kind of hold ground and push back against some of this normalization of how we speak about gender, sex, and sexuality data. Basically, my frustration is the word common sense is taking over our political discussions, and there's a lot wrong with common sense, whether in political spaces or data more broadly. My second path forward is around institutional competence. Across universities, industry, business, we're collecting a lot of data about LGBTQ communities, particularly in the context of the UK at the moment. Many decision makers, senior leaders are being tasked with leading data reviews, projects, and policies around gender, sex, and sexuality data. But often, the people asked to lead these kind of projects have very poor knowledge of the topic that they're asked to investigate, whether lacking expertise or experience. Often in my work, these people often also don't know how little they don't know. This means that when they first encounter a piece of research or a review with a strong anti-trans bias, they're not equipped to read between the lines. They can't hear or see the dog whistles in the work they're engaging. My third theme, or my third path forward, is a question of refusal and subversion. And I think this is a particularly important theme in this current political moment. We need to stop always trying to fix things. Some data systems and institutions more broadly are beyond repair. We need to create spaces that support the growing number of people who choose to refuse. This might involve undertaking meaningful analysis of survey respondents who prefer not to say. It might be adding disclaimers to our research that highlight kind of issues around missing data or why data might be missing. Or it might be about channeling money and resources to staff, to colleagues, to research participants who are punished by institutions for breaking the rules. And my fourth and final point is something I write about in the new book, and it's about how we need to build for the box breakers. In Rainbow Trap, I describe box breakers as the many individuals who fall between categorical cracks, the many people constrained by the narrowness of the options made available to them. So when we begin our research or data projects by foregrounding lives that are incongruous, out of place, or do not pass, we quickly see how categories and classifications are everywhere. They're always determining what is possible and impossible, determining who is possible and impossible. So I'm going to stop there and finish with a shameless plug for the new book, which published last week, called Rainbow Trap, Queer Lives, Classifications, and the Dangers of Inclusion, with a wee promo code for anybody who'd like to grab a copy at a slightly discounted rate. I'm looking forward to our discussion. I'm not going to kind of speak to these questions, but when kind of compiling my slides earlier today, there's many things that remain unanswered to me that I'm genuinely keen to hear more about. These were just some of the kind of questions that kind of came to mind when looking at some of the commonalities and differences between doing this work in the UK and the US, and more broadly, thinking about gender, sex, and sexuality data. But I'm going to stop there, and I'm looking forward to our discussion.
Thank you so much, Kevin. That was very informative, and I really appreciate you contributing to this. So what I would love now is for us to have a discussion. There's already some questions in the Q&A. I'm looking to take about 15 minutes or so for us to talk about things. Now, one of the ideas that popped up in my head was also something that someone left in the Q&A, which is a statement that Delane had made, which is data collection is a political act. And I think that is such a strong statement that also ties into your work, Kevin. And I'm wondering if either of you have ideas or senses or things that you want to talk about regarding this concept that Delane was talking about with shifting identities, that, you know, collecting data is a way for us to show that different communities exist, right? Without that data, we don't have the actual evidence or, you know, agreed upon evidence that community exists. And I think as we are collecting more data, we are understanding populations, communities on a more intricate level. At least that is a possibility. And so I'm wondering if you have any ideas about the future, either the future that you hope for and envision, or the future that you see different governments trying to curtail, perhaps. Because at the end of the day, this makes me think about how it is our perceptions that shape our reality. And that as we have a more nuanced set of vocabulary, we have a better idea of what's possible for us, or better words that describe who we are or what we believe and so forth. So I'm wondering if either of you have any thoughts on this kind of very large, nebulous topic that I'm trying to talk about. Whoever feels compelled, feel free to unmute yourself.
I'm happy to go first. I think it's a really interesting question. I think my views have definitely become more pessimistic, I would say, in the past 5 or 6 years, considering kind of political developments in the UK. I think when I wrote Queer Data in kind of 2020, 2021, I was far more optimistic about the kind of power of visibility, of recognition, of being counted in something like a national census. Increasingly, I find that, particularly in large data collection exercises, there is a hostility often in counting people who are understood as, or kind of positioned as unfathomable or incomprehensible, or of a sexuality or gender or sexual orientation that doesn't fit the assumptions of the institution within which the data collection is taking place. And I think that kind of short video I shared earlier, I think really typifies that point, in that the experience in Scotland of adding questions on sexual orientation and trans status were generally not that controversial when they counted lesbian, gay, bisexual, and trans. But if you were anything other than heterosexual, cisgender, anything other than those categories, then you were often met with ridicule or seen as an identity that wasn't real or wasn't really worth counting. So I do have concerns that we're having to wait for the kind of window of acceptability of these powerful, kind of dominant institutions to tell us when we are ready to be counted. And I think that is something, a game I don't think we should be playing that much into, in terms of kind of entrusting these large institutions to count us, to see us. So I think from these kind of top-down, larger data collection exercises, I'm skeptical. I think in terms of maybe community, grassroots research, I think I'm far more optimistic about the power of those types of tools. But I think my experience of the census design in Scotland, I don't think that these communities, anything outside of these kind of normative categories, are meaningfully counted in ways that really kind of help public profile, kind of visibility of recognition. Often it was just a case of ridicule or being dismissed as not a real sexual orientation. So that's my slightly skeptical take on it.
Thank you. Delane, I was wondering, do you have anything to add here?
This is a very interesting time, because I found that I've had very different feelings in the past year. Um, you know, for me, in this sense of my career, uh, there's so much we've gained and that I see that we have now that I never thought we would have in my lifetime. I'm kind of not used to even having the data. So the fact that we have some data, I get kind of excited about that. And I guess in some ways that's actually kind of sad. Uh, and then but I do recognize the ways it has improved my life and it has improved the queer community in the world around me. And I can give a very explicit example of working on the first census drop data from the 2000 data. And, you know, some of the first analysis we did was to enumerate, say, we looked at some of the big cities in Texas, because that's where we were. And I should say, if you've ever heard me talk before, I've probably stated this because it's been very profound to me most recently. But, you know, initially I'm trained in social psychology. And my experience was I wasn't able to really go give a talk without talking about my experience of being an out gay person from Texas. And I got into this work because I got fed up one day and I went home and I was like, I knew a demographer and I was like, Dudley, we have to find out how many gays are in Texas because nobody believes me. And definitely nobody believes me that I can thrive here and that I'm supported here. And I just would like to start off with a number that I'm not the only one and there's actually a lot of gays here because I can't even give my talks, you know, like we can't ever talk about the stuff I want to talk about. And anyway, in doing this, we figured out how many gays were in Texas and specifically Houston. And at one point, I think like the Better Business Bureau invited my group of friends and demographers down to give a little talk on like what we'd found about Houston. And I'm going to tell you, the Houston Pride Parade had never had a mayoral candidate in its life before. And in April, they found out how gay Texas was or how Houston was. And every Democratic mayoral candidate was then in the gay pride parade in June or July, whenever it was. I think it was July. I think theirs was later. Anyway, it was really profound. And then they also had their first lesbian mayor that year. I'd like to send a shout out to my hometown that just had their first lesbian mayor this year, just elected. But it's interesting because I think that one of the biggest ways I've seen the census data impact US nationally has actually been to have gay representation in our legislation and to see who's counted. I think it also sucks because I've also seen certain groups get pushed aside. So for example, you know, maybe they make candidates make decisions to like, okay, I'm going to speak to the gay vote here and quit speaking to this other population's vote, right? So I've seen that, and that's troublesome. But I think overall, I'm a little more optimistic about things. I feel like there's a little more of an ebb and a flow. I do remember when I thought the world was going to be over because Bush was governor of Texas, and then same thing about when he was president, and then first time Trump. And so, I mean, I'm hopeful, although it does feel different this time. It really does feel different. I also come from the Alamo City, so I don't, you know, I think at this point, everything I'm doing is about to be a fight. I'm surprised when I don't have to fight. So I think in some ways I've been optimistic because I think lately the fact that we're having these conversations is so amazing. I've had at least 4 or 5 conversations, academic conversations like this on this level with various institutions or various associations this year. You know, the first decade of my life in academia, we did not have these conversations, or they were at bars like after certain talks were given and so forth. So I think for me, I have a little bit more of an optimistic perspective, in part because I can grasp on a tangible things that I feel like things have happened. But it does feel really harsh right now. And I think it is going to be very interesting to maybe take a pause and really recognize what we do know and not get arrogant or confident about it. And to really be thoughtful about things like people's fears and concerns for data collection and with data collection. You know, I feel like I get a little practical here. You know, I don't think I have to have the entire population counted to kind of have an idea of what they probably feel and think, right? And to know if they need help and how to help them. So I think there's a little bit that you can take with a grain of salt. But I do think there's also another issue that we don't talk enough about with data collection, and it's the discrepancy in understanding between the cis straight population and say the queer population. Because I think moving into this past year, what I felt like we were kind of paused at and having some issues with in America was the straight population's understanding of how to identify. So like one of the big issues is really keeping the straight data clean. it's more problematic if they answer wrong than if like LGBT answers wrong, right? Error-wise. And I don't think we talk enough about that. But a lot of these measures, people are like, these measures feel so outdated. And I'm like, yeah, but my mom can answer it. Like, honestly, it's written for the straight population to answer accurately. And it turns out queer people can also, and don't seem to be too bothered by it. You know, maybe they would prefer something different, but they kind of get what you're going with and are willing to work with us. We also have educational campaigns on how to fill these out on, you know, like particularly with the census, because nobody really knew what an unmarried partner was, right? And so, you know, I don't think we talk enough as demographers or as scholars about how we train the population to take surveys or train them to identify to get the goals that they want. But I'll tell you, at like age 6 and 7, I learned real quickly that I was a boy for that boy Happy Meal when I was asked what my gender was at the McDonald's, you know. And you know, Jay Cruz called me my whole life, and I've said I want the male magazine. So you know, I think we also need to recognize, particularly within America, I largely speak to America, and I do think this changes globally, but particularly within America, that people can have an understanding of maybe what the survey is trying to get at, and the goals of the survey, and why people might want to know. I know I myself have a hard time answering. I think the Trans Health Survey or the US Trans Discrimination Survey, oh my God, y'all, like I had the hardest time taking that. And like, I think it's because I study this, but as you know, it's kind of like, I don't actually know my sexual orientation because I may not know my gender, right? So some of these questions are also contingent upon. I think it's also interesting to think about what data people opt to speak about, particularly when they're being critical of data. You know, I've had a lot of people ask me about certain data sets, you know, related for certain research questions. And I was like, well, I just wouldn't even use that data set for that research question. I would use, like, say, the trans health data if I want to speak to trans experiences or look at variation across categories of within, you know, I wouldn't use the BRFSS for that, right? Now, if I want to speak comparatively, I would maybe, right? So I think it's really important to recognize the ways that demography can be a tool, the way that data collection can be a tool, and the way that we can manipulate it, right? So as long as we can recognize it, it can be manipulated, and others may be manipulating it or misusing it also. So, you know, we're supposed to have the ethical integrity to not do that. But I think we can recognize that, and I try to interact with it more as a tool, which I think maybe that also gives me a sense of more control and more optimism. But
That's great. Yeah, and I think that that touches upon that concept that Kevin was talking about of like this window of, you know, when we're writing surveys, we have to know the population and what words is that population familiar with to make sure that we are trying to capture the thing that we're trying to capture here. So
yeah.
kind of connected to that, we got a question. There's several questions. One in particular, uh, someone asks, if you were designing a census, what recommendations would you have for collecting SOGIS data? If you have any recommendations of whether even that should be included in the census, I don't know if you guys have thoughts on that.
Yeah.
Who wants to
Do
go
you want to go
first?
first? You can go first.
Big question, big question.
Yes.
I get asked a version of this question quite a lot, about how do we design kind of a perfect SOGI question, a perfect question on gender, sex, sexuality. It's always going to be contextual. It's always going to be specific in terms of what we're measuring. But just to kind of build on some of the points that Delane mentioned earlier, which I think speak to this really well, is as I highlighted in my talk, the UK, there's actually 3 different types of censuses take place in the UK. And the census in England and Wales, which took place in 2021, so a year before Scotland, made a right mess up of their question on trans status or gender identity. So much so that the data collected in the census was ultimately discredited because of the poor quality of the information captured. And the reason being was people's comprehension of a question. So the question was, I think, somewhat confusingly worded in terms of it asks whether your gender is the same as your sex registered at birth with yes or no response options. Whereas as in Scotland, the question was different, and the question asked whether you are trans or identify as having a trans history. And I think Delane mentioned a really good point in terms of we have to design questions that make sense to everyone, because the huge issue we have in something like a census are false positives. And I love the phrase you said there about keeping the straight data clean. In terms of that, really, is a key challenge when you're working with groups where we know that 99% of the population are going to answer in one way and 1% roughly are going to answer in another way. And so much so that in England and Wales, we missed this amazing opportunity to capture robust population level data about the size of the trans community, all because the wording and the comprehension of that just didn't make sense. So I've seen some interesting things in the US, kind of earlier when census testing was taking place for sexual orientation, where they had that kind of caveat add-on, kind of straight brackets, not gay or lesbian. So I am interested in how we make sense of our identity by defining ourselves against another as well. So will you increase the number of straight people who understand themselves as straight when they know that I'm straight? Because I'm definitely not gay or lesbian. But actually, when doing something like a census, which is very different from designing maybe a community survey or something kind of reaching directly to LGBTQ groups and organizations, where people's knowledge of who they are, how they identify will probably be more kind of, I would say, better, more advanced, more kind of nuanced than it would be for a kind of general population study. So as much as it sometimes feels really awful to do as somebody interested in kind of queer data, LGBTQ data, we do need to design questions that make sense to a population who are often unfamiliar with these terms, who might be for the first time coming into contact with the word trans or gay or bisexual. So I think that would probably be one piece of guidance that kind of builds on what I think is a really interesting kind of point that Delane mentioned earlier.
Yeah, I know with the US Census, sometimes they make decisions, but you have to understand and hear like why they make the decision the way they make it. And you're like, that actually makes sense right now. That's the other thing is I feel like, everybody gets so worried about creating the question now as if it's never going to change again or doesn't or can't ever change. I know a big issue with the US Census was the fact the sex question had never changed before, and the idea of like the longitudinally it aligning. And I just remember thinking, I think every article now starts off with age and sex have historically never been changed on the US Census in demography now. And I just remember everybody being so scared of changing this. And I was like, yeah, what you guys are really saying is like literally every other question has changed and adapted to time. Right. So y'all are so stuck on like, we can't change it. Like, really, that's just your fear talking about sex or changing sex or something. Because Americans are they're so concerned with changing sex, like, oh, what if you change your mind? Well, I mean, I changed it once. Why can't I change it back? Right. Like, maybe I'm a little flippant about this, but I don't know. When I had top surgery, my mom's like, what if you want your chest back? And I'm like, guess what? They can do that too. Like, these aren't problems I think about, but it's so funny that people go there so quickly. Like, what if you remove this part of your body and you want it back? And I'm like, that's so weird you're thinking about that, in my opinion. Like, what if you like that part of your body and you never want to remove it? What does this tell us about anything? So people are just genuinely triggered by sex in America. I think whether you're talking about the act or an identity, they are. They also are so ignorant to biology and like what actual sex is. Like I think our world would be so different if sociologists had taken biology. Or if I don't know, like I feel like all the farm kids are the ones showing up right now. We're like, oh, we know that's not natural, or like we've seen that kind of calf born before. But it's fascinating to me where these things come from. Even the idea, I was thinking about this, Kevin, you mentioned the trans history. When I saw that question, I was like, I would have been so flustered because I'm newly trans. So I don't actually have a history of trans, but I do identify as trans now. And then I get into the philosophical world of the and the or. And, and I can't take a multiple choice test to save my soul since George Bush's No Child Left Behind, created test anxiety. So now I'm like, I don't know what I am. And, here I am technically one of the excerpts of this. So I get how complicated it can be in that moment, but it's also interesting because I have faith in how we collect it and aggregate it up, and then we can kind of see, I kind of keep my my footing more on the idea of like the trends is what I'm interested in explaining and so forth. Because there's a lot of times we're exceptions to the rules, but there's also a lot of times we fall right in line. And so to me, that's where I keep my focus. But yeah, like to be honest with you, a lot of the concessions that I think we make in question construction, we could also see that it was a bad concession, but we kind of had a chance to still go for it if we did this one thing. And then we can learn from that and change that. So like I love Scotland since like the early 2000s. Scotland has been ahead of us as Americans. And I've been reading like what Scotland did and why Scotland did what they did. And we've been learning about it. And when mistakes are made, I think a lot of us can be like, see, or knew that would happen. I could think about this in relationship to the NASM report. When we were writing the NASM report, we already knew some of it was old. But because our hands were tied to base everything on empirical tests that were published at this point, we already knew there's gonna be a huge problem with non-binary, right? And we don't really have that in any of our questions. We have some that are trans/non-binary, but in my American marriage survey, those two populations may be very different. And in fact, I find in that survey, if I remember correctly, I'm just starting to get into this. This is like my next project after this talk. But I find that trans men have attitudes that are more in line with men, and trans women have attitudes more in line with women on marriage. And but then on like resources and outcomes, non-binary and trans are more aligned. Does that make sense? So trans and non-binary might like have more similar incomes or similar household structures or access to marriage. But attitudinally, maybe we should be lumping the trans men with the men and the trans women with the women on certain topics, but these aren't protocols we've really assessed and discussed yet. So I think we have a whole new population, the new age cohorts coming in, and they're shaking the world up. We have the bi women driving, the rates, the new quote LGBT rates. We also have the L decreasing and the T increasing. So there's a whole lot of stuff going on there that's potentially going to be important for us to pay attention to and kind of listen. But I do think we're able to adapt. I think we can learn. I think we can make mistakes and we can then adapt. So that's maybe I am an optimist. Maybe that's my optimism.
So somewhat connected to that, we have a question or comment that touches upon this issue that I feel like we've kind of implicitly been talking about, which is different cultures, different countries are tackling this question of, let's say, queer data in different ways, right? We use different words, we have different ideas, because these are constructs that are informed by culture. Okay, so I'm going to read to you what this comment is, and then I want to see what your take is, or if you have any advice. They say, in research, I find it challenging to talk about how many people around the world don't identify with Western categories of queer and transness. But when looking at their culture, pre-colonial history, and relationship dynamic, they are just queer and trans. Is anyone else having these conversations or talking about counting those of us who identify differently? So I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on this kind of like, at least in America, I feel like we often focus just on the American perspective, and these are the words and these are the terms that we have in America. But I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on this particular question.
I mean, I think that there's, this is a part where your opinion is kind of framing your thought, right? And your version of how you identify people. So I think culturally, particularly across the globe, you have to really, have discussions with stakeholders and get with the people and figure out what's going on culturally, right? I know that just my cultural experience of high school had a very different definition of what was gay compared to, say, my son's experience now. So across time and across culture, I think it's important to think about that. I think that how people are treated is also how people identify in addition to how they're treated, in addition to how they're culturally identified, right, by researchers or by academics becomes, super important. You see this happen a lot with the behavioral measures, right? So people say they have certain behavior and then they get identified as, say, gay, right? I mean, I feel like this is like the main debate of the Kinsey numbers, right? At what point are you gay or not gay, or where are you bi, or if you break it up, what do we do? You can make sensible decisions and then say, here's how you made your decision, right? But you are holding people to an identity classification that you then created based on a different kind of measure, right? So I think it's super important to recognize there's such thing as a culture. I think there's a lot of people who are queer in sex that are very much a part of straight culture, and vice versa. So I think, I know a lot of queer people that have very straight sex. So like, it's kind of an interesting idea when people think of it that way. But I do think like we're able to disentangle it and get into it in America more so than in other places. And I think in some locations identity is more profound and impactful to people than in other places. Like gay identities may not be that big of an impact in other locations. And or you may be killed for having that identity, thus would not want to identify as, right? So yeah, I think the different countries and different cultures within the country may also have and different classes, and I'm going to say class like economically. Like I do feel like Mexico has a different has different attitudes towards people who are well off versus impoverished having gay sex. So different things become important within the cultural context, and you do have to get on the ground and actually understand that and know that within that culture. I think also on the flip side of that's something that's kind of interesting to point out is I think when we talk about, say, a country surveying or a country doing this work, we might forget to recognize that there's maybe a lot of queer people in those institutions doing that work. Sometimes you have a lot of allies doing work, and then sometimes you have queer people also doing that work. And so it's how people identify and whether they're out or not, whether they can be out, whether they feel safe. Privacy concerns, all of that can have a huge effect on data collection, globally speaking. Also, the way we take up censuses globally is very different. So like in some countries, we have like just admin records, and they just put you together based on your administrative data, like in the Nordic countries and so forth, and people may have rights. And in other countries, they may actually send people to people's houses, in which case that would be a different way of having to identify and might potentially be more dangerous, right? And then in some places it's criminalized. We don't even ask the question, but we do try to figure out who people are because we want to criminalize them. So, it's very complicated when you speak globally and across countries. I definitely don't think there's a single measure that's the best measure to collect, quote, sexual orientation. Like we can't even identify what sexual orientation is right now, or I'll agree on that, right? I'm not a big fan of best as a single. I think that we're creative and innovative, and I think we can also be malleable and adaptive. And so I like thinking more so like what is a good practice and a good practice for my research question or my research goal. So that's how I think through it.
Yeah, I think so. I am actually based in a business school at the University of Edinburgh. So quite a lot of my kind of research looks at how do organizations, businesses, multinational companies kind of collect, analyze, and use data about gender, sex, and sexuality. So a question I'm often asked is how, as a kind of large multinational company, do we design our diversity monitoring form? We're asking our kind of global workforce how they identify their sexuality, their race, whether or not they identify as disabled. And as Delane mentioned, there's no kind of one-size-fits-all model for any of this work. But what is often problematic is this kind of supplanting of this kind of global north Anglo-centric approach to identity, to data. In the UK, there's a very particular way of doing it, kind of framed by equalities legislation, where we have like 9 protected characteristics, where when we're capturing data about our identity, we often are asked these 9 questions about these 9 characteristics. But that doesn't translate to many other countries. It's very unique to what's happening in the UK. And even when I was thinking through some of the work I'm doing with colleagues in the US right now around kind of SOGI data, I always find it fascinating how in countries that we think in terms of gender, sex and sexuality are quite similar, global north, Anglo-centric, there are also huge differences in how we capture data about the trans population. As I mentioned in my talk earlier, the two-step question is not at all common in the UK. It's actually would seen as quite invasive, maybe to ask a kind of a two-step question when trying to measure the trans population. So again, in countries that we think seem quite similar, there are actually methodological kind of key differences in how these two countries we'd ask those questions. So something which I'm working on with a colleague at Cornell at the moment is trying to kind of unpick and untangle why these methodological differences have kind of manifested in countries that in many ways, in terms of gender, sex, and sexuality, do seem quite similar. So even at that kind of local or kind of closer level, each kind of research tool needs to fit the context within which it's working.
Thank you so much. So I think that, we've done a great job of answering these questions. What I want to do right now is just give the floor to Delane and Kevin to see if there's any concluding thoughts or any like last statements or things that you want to leave the audience with.
Do you want me to go first, Kevin? So I think really for me, the biggest takeaway is this idea of context and that measurement has to be collected in context, in context of your goals, in context of your resources, and in context of the people that you're interacting with, right? I will say that I am pro trying to collect data, and I do think that it's very important that we have survey data, nationally representative survey data. How can we assess impact if we're not measuring, right? We cannot document harms at that point. And, so I tend to lean on that, lean towards that area. Visibility, comes with the potential of backfire, but I also feel like, in many ways, I guess maybe I've already been out or we've already been visible enough. It reminds me of individuals who did talk to us when we did interviews for our parenting project. Is that what that was for? I think so, yes. And they talked with us about their concerns about identifying on the census. And I thought it was very interesting because often they would indicate that they did have some concerns sometimes, but more people than not did not have concerns about identifying on the census in America. Those who did were interesting to me because they still tended to lean towards go ahead and identify. But it was also interesting because, we would find out things like they were HRC members and they tax deducted their donations and things like that. So there are other ways they can also be counted. I think sometimes counting on the census explicitly does bring up the Holocaust and being found and so forth. And so that in itself is also a different obstacle to have to hurdle. I find it weird to identify my sex or my sexuality to my boss, right? So like when my university asks about me, so it's interesting to think about when and how we feel comfortable to identify. But I think it's important for us to also note how people will be taken care of when we do that, and how to let them make that option what's best for them and the way that they want to have the greatest, like, in this case for me, political voice, right, or autonomy to identify as, and also not identify, right? So I guess I'll just leave with that. Yeah, I feel like there was one other thing I did want to mention, but oh, I guess the other thing I wanted to mention was just problems with data collection, particularly with national censuses and so forth. When people get where it's like all dependent on like one householder, it's like one person gets to identify, and how tricky that gets too. I know we didn't really talk about that, but I guess like the proxies and the proxy measures, that we're using and trying out, that's a whole different other can of worms. But for the most part, I think it's good that we're trying these things, and I think we are going to mess up a lot, and I think that's actually okay. We can still learn something from that and hopefully improve.
You. Yes, I'll try and be brief, just with kind of some concluding thoughts. I would say I'm definitely a bit more of a skeptic, but I'm still in the kind of pro trying to design collection methods that count these communities in the most meaningful, most impactful way, while also alongside that, I think building a society and building a world where we protect and we acknowledge those who do choose to refuse, those who don't want to share data about their gender, their sex, their sexuality, the people who tick the prefer not to say box, those who select other or use the write-in boxes. We need to ensure that our data systems are as ready for those kind of populations and those communities, because I think in the current political climate, they will continue to grow, and we shouldn't treat that data as being less valuable or discarded or something to throw in the bin, but actually design our systems to acknowledge that is an active choice to engage in data collection exercises in that way. I think just to reiterate that, as we've highlighted, data is all about politics, it's all about power, it's all about history. And even when we're dealing with something like numbers, we think have this kind of apolitical veneer about them. It's nothing like that at all. I think as soon as we scratch the surface, we see that it's all about decisions made about who counts and in what context do they count. And I think just having that critical, nuanced approach to the work that we all do is really central to ensuring that our data kind of methods and projects acknowledge and try as best as possible to kind of capture the full diversity and the full kind of complexity of the world around us.
Thank you so much for those concluding thoughts. And again, it's been a pleasure, Delane and Kevin. I really appreciate you taking the time to have these conversations. I feel like we had a great turnout, and people asked really, I think, insightful and difficult questions. And perhaps you enjoyed thinking about and pondering on those questions as well. I also want to say thank you to Donna Lalonde of the ASA, the American Statistical Association, for hosting this webinar. And again, if you happen to have any comments, any questions, feel free to direct it to Donna or the ASA. You can Google the LGBTQ plus advocacy committee for the ASA if you want more information on our committee. We also have an email list for our friends group. So, when we have more public um, events like this, that's one way to be aware of that. And with that, I'm going to say thank you. I hope you guys, everyone, has a great rest of the week. It's Pride Month, and I hope that you're able to celebrate however you feel comfortable celebrating. So, thank you so much. Have a good Monday. Have a good week, and take care, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.